Welcome, everyone, to What the Force. It's my 5th year anniversary. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host, and joining me for this special episode is my good friend, Michael Cohen. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to start off right at the bat. I'm just going to gush. I'm going to get it out of the way. I mean, congratulations on 5 years. That's a huge, huge milestone. Most podcasts don't make it past 5 episodes. So the fact that you've done as many as you have on the variety of topics all across the last 5 years, like it's such an accomplishment. It is such a huge honor for me as a fan of the podcast, first and foremost, to get to come on and have this conversation with you that we're going to have. It means a lot to me. Thank you for having me.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on and to talk with me about this and really ask me questions was because you've been podcasting for 15 years.
It's the anniversary of Clone Wars, right? Because that's when I started, was when Clone Wars started. So yeah, in August of this year, it'll be 15 years.
And so you kind of understand the stick-to-itiveness, the longevity of having a podcast for a significant length of time. And especially you are primarily soloing, you have guest hosts on different podcasts, but it's primarily you. I'm in a similar situation. And so it's hard. It is absolutely a labor of love. And I couldn't think of anyone else who was better equipped to understand and empathize with that than you.
That's such a huge compliment. That makes me feel really good. But yeah, I absolutely can relate. And since I went from being just a listener to being your friend and us talking about podcasting and oftentimes griping, right? I having that person that you can go oh my God, this is what I'm dealing with, right?
Yeah.
I know that we deal with a lot of the same stuff, which is we have all of these great friends who want to come and join us for the party, but then they leave and then you gotta clean up all of the dishes and put everything back the way that it's supposed to be after everybody leaves the party. And that's the part of podcasting that I think that a lot of people they don't know that that's there when they first get into it. And that's why most podcasts end after 5, right? Because everybody goes no, this will be awesome. We have such great conversations. All we have to do is record them and put them on the internet. And you're yeah, that's, yep. And then you gotta make sure you're posting it on all the social media channels. You gotta make sure that all the feeds are updating properly across everything. Oh no, there's a problem with WordPress. Oh no, there's something going on with my domain hosting this week. I don't know what's going. And it's there's all these secret things that happen behind the scenes. Nobody else is gonna clean up that mess. You got to clean it up yourself. So a lot of that stuff happens in 5 years.
A lot of it, and I've had crazy ups and downs. And being so emotionally drained, I was am I quitting the podcast? And yeah, I've gotten to that point. No, seriously, I have. But sometimes just taking a break is actually what you need. And this is just my very weird hobby. And I call it that with love. But it is just something I do because I love it. And there is no other reason. I've got a Patreon. That's cool. It helps pay the bills. But it's not for money. It's really not. And I love my listeners and I love that they join in the conversation and they support the conversation. The community is amazing, but I first and foremost have to do this for me. And so I did want to celebrate this anniversary, as reticent as I am to even congratulate myself on this milestone. But if you don't celebrate milestones, you don't mark and see and look back at how far you've come, you can't really take those lessons into you and take them forward on the next part of your journey.
It's a tough thing because you don't want to be egotistical about it and go oh my God, 5 years, what an accomplishment. But at the same time, you absolutely deserve a victory lap on something like that, right? It is a worthwhile thing to take a second and celebrate yourself every once in a while. I think that's healthy. I always have to make sure that I'm keeping myself happy first, and then hope that there are other people out there that are going to connect with that thing about it that made me happy, right? And that's podcasting is the same thing. And I think that that's like the truest way to be successful with anything like this, is just, if I'm making something that I like, then somebody else out there is going to like it. The hard part is often finding those people.
Finding people that are interested in hearing what I have to say has actually been maybe a little too easy sometimes. A little too easy. I think there's just, it comes down to what I talk about in Star Wars. When you get like good Star Wars or good story, Willow is an example. Do you have something to say? Do you have something genuine to say? And if you do, it's going to come out and people are going to resonate with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I only talk about things I want to talk about. It's a lot. It's definitely the equivalent of a part-time job for a hobby from a labor perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a lot. So yes, appreciate your local podcaster. Please, everyone, leave ratings and reviews on your podcast apps. And like, it actually does help. It positive does comments on Twitter and positive, like when somebody posts a social media thing or engaging in the conversation or saying, I really like this. Like, it's weird how much that helps.
Yeah.
Like just being outwardly supportive helps a lot.
The community often, I think, is why those of us who stick in it are still here, is because the community like lifts you up in those moments. Let's switch into interview mode. I transform into interview mode, and let me ask you a question. I'm borrowing a question from my old format on Forced Perspectives. What is the thing that got you into Star Wars? Like, how did you become a Star Wars fan?
I don't know how much I've talked about this on the podcast. I'm having trouble remembering all of my 260 plus episodes of the pod. So when I was growing up, my dad was a nerd. He saw Star Wars opening weekend. It was before I was born, obviously. I'm Return of the Jedi age, not, New Hope age. And he was always into the same things that George Lucas was into. He watched serials. He was into nerd stuff, war games, all of the sort of TV shows like Flash Gordon he watched as a kid. And when he saw Star Wars, he said, we can finally do science fiction on the big screen. Because he was a big science fiction and fantasy nerd. And he always thought Darth Vader was more complicated than The New Hope or Star Wars made him out to be. And so like he was always into it. So he bought the LPs. He has a doctorate he had a doctorate in philosophy, always kind of like a road scholar. And so he was a student of history, mythology, religion, all of that. Like as somebody with a PhD in philosophy, you kind of never stop learning. You just want to learn. And so my dad would get up every single morning, make himself coffee and like be reading a history book or be reading Joseph Campbell or everything. So like Star Wars was actually always around me. I actually don't remember a period of time where it wasn't. But my first memory of Star Wars, I think I was maybe 2 or 3, really young. And I was like laying on the floor looking up at the television. And it was the scene where Luke walks into Jabba's palace with R2. And there's C-3PO. And I knew who C-3PO and R2 was because I had already been seeing it. So it's always been part of like me. And I just remember that moment so much. Later on, I would watch them on repeat on my old Betamax, and my dad would be playing the LPs and he would tell me about Joseph Campbell and he would tell me about Kurosawa influences and he would tell me about all of the makeup of Star Wars because my dad would read about these things and he could tell the Hidden Fortress parallels and he could tell me about John Williams from a musical perspective. Like I had the benefit of having a professor at home, teaching me to think about these things from the get-go. I guess I'm a Nepo baby in that way, in that I didn't have to discover it as some sort of rebellion against my parents. Yeah. It was given to me like a gift and I was always valuable of Star Wars was always, like I was always worthy of Star Wars. Star Wars was always for me. My dad also wrote role-playing games. He was the author of Chivalry and Sorcery, which was second to D&D in the 80s. Cool stuff. But was always fascinated with other systems. And so we also played the West End Games version of Star Wars when I was like in grade 4 or 5, and he would run games for like me and my friends. And we actually played a game where I played a kid template where I had a slingshot. I was force sensitive. I was basically Ezra.
Yeah.
We ran through a planet that was run by frog people that were so much like the Gungans. And it was just something my dad had made up. Mm-hmm. And I was always the hero in those stories because my dad was doing this for me. So Star Wars was always for me, always. And I always had this place in Star Wars, and Star Wars loved me.
You use the term Nepo baby, right? And it's like, that's a privilege, right? Like it was a privilege for you to have an experience like that at home with a parent that brought you into it.
Both my parents are highly educated people. My mom, library science and English degree. My dad, doctorate in philosophy and a law degree. So it's not like I was ever not around people who were critical thinkers or did research to find out answers to why things happened. Mm-hmm. And if it was related to Star Wars, like my dad wanted to know why. And I just had it through osmosis in so many ways. The prequels were mine. I remember when the new versions came out, like special editions, my dad and I would drive to the bigger city that actually had the theaters that were showing them to go and see them. And that was actually really cherished because we would make it a big deal. Like the two of us would go. We'd have these really great conversations about Star Wars and what it meant on the way there. It was over an hour drive both ways. And then the prequels came out while I was in my last year of high school. And all of my friends were so excited for the prequels and like to see Jedi, actual Jedi, like not like Luke, cool, Yoda, sure, Obi-Wan, but like young Jedi who could do moves and, you know, like, you're into the Flash and everything like that at that time. I briefly dated a guy who dressed up as Darth Maul on opening weekend, full makeup.
That's awesome.
And like the prequels were my thing and the Clone Wars were my thing. I went and saw the Clone Wars in the theater, like the movie. I got back from a trip to Japan for Attack of the Clones, I think, and showed up at the theater like I hadn't slept in like 24 hours, but I had to be there to see it opening night. And so I went like, I love Star Wars. It's part of who I am, and it's never not been there for me.
Hear you talk about it, to hear you like put it in very like concrete terms, for me, like that's really enjoyable because it comes across in the podcast. I think you actually already answered one of the questions from the audience because you tweeted out, hey, if anybody has any questions for me, now is the time. I wanted to call this out because you basically have answered this, but we can maybe dig a little bit deeper if you want to. Loraz Orley, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, asked what began your love of mythic fiction and what led you to dive deeper into it. So I feel like the first half of that, I think you've kind of answered. Obviously, it came from your dad, right? It came from that relationship, and you learned those skills from him.
There's more if you want to hear more.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I'll say you have such an incredible mind for the mythic stuff that like I love this stuff and I like to think that I'm pretty smart about it, but at the same time like you just have such a grasp of it, almost like encyclopedic. You and Missy during the Following Willow stuff has just been like it's been so awe-inspiring with the way that you guys will just pull something. You'll be talking about something mythic and then Missy comes in with something fairy tale and then she's talking about fairy tales and you're like, well, this is what Joseph Campbell said about that. And like the two of you going back and forth was so delightful. So talk about where that comes from.
Missy loves fairy tales so much that she literally has them like stamped on her DNA now. And I am in awe of her all the time. And she has been just like a wonderful co-host for Power of Myth and Symbolism, as well as for Willow. And Willow has just been an absolute joy to cover. And I look forward to more seasons of it. Like, absolutely. So I took psychology in school, and I know that probably somebody's asked me that question, like, well, did you go to school for mythology? And I did almost get a mythology minor. So it was one course short, basically. And I've always loved mythology and how it connected to psychology. But I didn't really like put all of these pieces together until I was older. Like in university, like you're still kind of forming as a human, and you like these things and they make sense to you and they're interesting. And I had all of this background knowledge from my dad and just kind of being around it from an osmosis perspective. But it wasn't until something like, I would say it was almost like it snapped or awoken in me when I watched The Last Jedi that I was able to like understand that this has been here this whole time. And I know that sounds so weird, but I've always had like quite I don't know what the right word is, delicate psyche, but like I'm very affected by media. I really feel it. I really get a good sense of things. I actually have trouble watching horror movies, really things that are extremely intense. I have to like kind of pace myself and things like that because I just get a solid impression of what is trying to happen. And when I watched The Last Jedi, I went home after seeing it with a friend and my kids because, you know, we just happened to be on opening night. I had these tickets. We went and I had been, you know, seeing everything opening night since I was old enough to see it on my own. And I had the craziest dreams. Like, I still remember them. And they were deeply symbolic. And the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And the next day after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I kept on trying to talk to my husband, Kyle, about it. And I'm like, please talk to me about this. And he's like, I haven't seen the movie yet because I was busy with, you know, the things he had going on at that time. So once he had seen it like a week later, he was like, okay, we can talk about it. And I talked to him about it for like 2 weeks straight. So this is like January now, and I'm still talking to him about The Last Jedi. And he's like, Marie Claire, I'm going to need you to talk to somebody else. I no longer care.
Your husband and my wife need to start a support group. When something really, really digs in, when it gets under your skin in that way.
Yeah. It's like an itch that like, or like it's something that's boiling under the surface that you just like can't get out of you.
Yeah.
You inevitably go online because nobody will talk to you about these things, right? In your personal life, because you're like, you have the benefits of having the internet, and you can go and find people who might be interested in talking about this in the same way as you are. And do you know what I found?
I mean, like, I imagine that you found a whole bunch of people talking about The Last Jedi, but
yeah, but they were saying that it sucked.
At the time.
And B, nobody was talking about The Last Jedi the way I wanted to talk about The Last Jedi.
Yeah.
0 people. There was books, obviously, about the original trilogy and about the connection to Joseph Campbell. There was the Magic of Myth book out there. There's tons of people writing about Star Wars and mythology. But it's like people forgot. And yeah, there was Raylos who were on Tumblr, but I didn't discover Tumblr. I was listening to podcasts, and all of the podcast hosts that I were listening to were men, and they hated it.
It took me 3 viewings of that movie to walk away and go like, oh, okay, so there's where I'm having the problem, is that this is actually like confronting something about me. Right. And then I was able to start processing everything else about it and go online and find people.
People are not always used to their media talking back to them.
Yeah.
Or so easily allowing the shadow aspects of themselves to be on full display.
Yeah.
And The Last Jedi calls to people's shadows to project onto it easily. And for good or for bad, we as Raylos also projected a lot onto it. A lot of the subtext is genuinely there. It's been confirmed by Rian Johnson and Mark Hamill and, you know, all of these things. The subtext is there. The symbolism is there. But it is our belief in it that gives it that power too. I mean, I've talked about it on the Willow Following Willow, the text being not subtext has been very, very important to me. But the symbolism was there, and the mythic storytelling and the structure was there, and especially the symbolism and how it resonates was really fascinating to me. And Kyle and I had just started doing TTRPGing, which is basically we record us playing RPGs, role-playing game around a table with a bunch of friends, and he was editing it. We had mics, we had the recording equipment. He's like, Marie Claire, why don't you go and talk to somebody else or the internet? Just talk to yourself and put it out there. And I was like, well, I can't do that. And he's like, sure you can. And so I did. And I originally asked two friends of mine, James and Liam, who were lovely humans who were super interested in joining me. They would never say that they were hosts. I was always the primary person with the podcast. They were just co-hosts that would come on occasionally. And they were lovely, and I covered like Rebels, the last season of Rebels with my friend James, and Liam would come on and we talk about the movies a little bit. But it wasn't as satisfying as I wanted it to be. Like if you go back to those early episodes, you're like, Marie Claire, what are you doing? You're just like trying to figure this out. And I was almost trying to like emulate what a lot of guy podcasts I had heard done. I literally could find no women podcasts. I know they existed now, but like it's hard. The internet is hard to find the like people you want to listen to, you know? And I made a lot of podcasts really, really quickly. And then Jason C. Fry's book on The Last Jedi, so the Last Jedi novelization came out. And I said to myself, I absolutely want to do a symbolic conversation about this because I haven't spoken about The Last Jedi on the podcast, even though that's the reason I'm podcasting. So this was March, so like a month and a half after I started podcasting. And I was doing a weekly podcast at that time. And I asked Ty Black, who had just done a video on The Last Jedi. And I said, hey, Ty, I love your work. Would you like to talk about The Last Jedi novelization with me? That podcast blew up like crazy. Like we did a two-parter. We talked about the symbolism and we talked about the story. And I think I told Jason C. Fry, I'm like, I'm so mad at you, Jason C. Fry. I love this book so much, but you forgot about the thigh grab in the throne room scene. And he tweeted out, sorry, I forgot about the thigh grab with relation to the podcast. And like, the podcast just like it was destroyed. People were mad at me for saying that. I'm like, it was a joke. People listened to it and were like, this is really good.
Did you and Ty have like a relationship before that? Like were you
I mean, Ty will probably remember better, but I remember she said, like, I'm thinking about doing a video on The Last Jedi, I think. And I said, I like jumped into her replies and I said, please do. There's not enough of this stuff out there. And then I DM'd her like after she had done the video. Sometimes all it takes is just saying yes to somebody. Like it's weird, you know, like I definitely felt like we needed this. She needed to do that. I needed to do this. And then once the Jason C. Fry like discussion of the novelization was out, I said, hey, Ty, do you want to do like a segment talking about the symbolism and mythology of Star Wars? And she said yes. And the first one we did was Star Wars is a fairy tale. I named it Power of Myth and Symbolism after Power of Myth. But just adding in the symbolism because I think that's also really important. And that's how we started doing those episodes. And then I would do other things that I was interested in. I was really interested in like how fandom grew, why people invest like years, months, hours every single day into fandom. So I did a lot of like what the fandom is in the beginning, talking about, you know, what this weird thing is. Why do we love it? And it really answered like what the Force developed into why Star Wars, you know, it developed into that. So like from a mythological perspective, it's like why Star Wars. And then I wanted to start talking about the music. So I started tweeting about the music and Christy Carew was like, please talk to me about the music. So I did. And then we turned it into this like crazy meta music segment where suddenly I'm actually having academics like Frank Lim and pay attention and want to talk to me about the music. What is life? I think yeah, it really started out was just asking, like, why does this work for me? Mm-hmm. Why is this important to me? Why? And I'm still asking whys. A great mentor I had through work asked me, you'll get to the answer, Marie Claire, if you ask why 5 times. Well, I've asked why way more than 5 times in the course of this podcast.
Yeah. This is what I always say. This is usually in reference to you and Ty. A lot of guys go on podcasts, and I'm speaking from my own personal perspective as well as just what I've observed. We go on podcasts and we talk with authority because we, especially those of us who are white, we've just been given authority by virtue of the way that society works. So we just talk with authority and we say stuff, and we kind of have half of the information most of the time, but we don't bother to research. We don't bother to put anything together. There's no notes. It's very Han Solo of us. That's why that archetype is very popular. You know, it's like, I'm just making this Indiana Jones. I'm making this up as I go. Right. And that is how I have always podcasted, and it's how I always will podcast. I've tried doing it the other way. It just doesn't work for me. But you guys put together these episodes and do so much work, and it comes across. And it's like, I've heard a few people, especially throughout the Following Willow stuff recently, sort of refer to it all as like a class, right? Like as a course. It's like this is education, and that's what attracts people. That's why Frank Lehman is coming on the podcast to talk to you about this stuff, because they recognize that and they see it and go, yeah, I'll be a part of that. I'll come hang out. I mean, the David Collins coming on and talking to you at length about Willow was such a fantastic episode. Shocking. Shocking to you, but not, I don't think to the audience, not shocking at all. Just a matter of those two ships meeting, right? Like that. Yeah. Like that's all it took, because what he does over on the soundtrack show is so similar to what you do on your show. So these brilliant people, they feel comfortable and at home with you, because you're not going to toot your own horn, but I'll toot your horn for you. You are a brilliant person, and the audience, we recognize that. We know.
I'm making a face.
Yeah.
I just like, and I do have a lot in my memory of things that I've read, but I still do a lot of reading and a lot of research, and I'm reading or I'm listening to an audiobook almost all the time. I wish I was bell hooks and I had time to read a book a day. I want to consume more knowledge so that I can think about these things and learn other people's perspectives and formulate my own. You know, it is absolutely interesting to read the same story and realize the beats and get it, and then come back to Joseph Campbell and be like, Joe, you weren't right about everything, but gosh darn it, you were right about the monomyth. And maybe there are better writers, or there's different perspectives that you can layer on to Campbell now, and you really should. Like, people shouldn't stop at Campbell. That's one thing I've talked with John Booker about from the Joseph Campbell Foundation. He's like, Campbell's a great place to start, but if you stop with him, you're going to be missing out on a lot of thought and a lot of perspective, but the grain of truth is still there. The seed that can start you on your journey is still there.
This brings us to another one of the listener questions. Blonde Tapperware asked, what did you first do or research to learn more about semiotics? What books did you read? So you make reference to things all the time, right? And the obvious ones are The Power of Myth and Hero with a Thousand Faces and that stuff.
And semiotics is specifically the study of symbolism. So let's talk about symbolism. Symbolism is just a language by which our culture speaks. And so most people, when they see something used in a highlighted way within a story, will get it on some sort of level, right? I listen to myself, my gut, a lot. I'm like, hey, that flute in Willow, Graydon's flute, that's going to be important. That flute is important. And, the writers have put it in there in such a way to highlight it, right? The butterfly, etc. These things are old. They're old for us. They have meaning to us from a cultural perspective. Butterflies cocoon as little worms. They get melted down and then become these beautiful creatures that enchant us. And it has this meaning because we as humans know this to be true. Semiotics is just another language by which we as a culture have communicated over time. And some of it is more structural, like something that we are used to seeing in our brains. So spiders are scary. And some of it is provided by the culture by which we live in. And so some of it has contextualized clues within knowing what the creators are pulling on from their inspirations. So when George uses a particular type of shot or thing like a lightsaber, it has a very specific symbolic meaning to George Lucas. And so we can use that to infer certain things about what the story is trying to say. I do a lot of reading of symbolic dictionaries, Jungian symbolism, dream analysis, or symbolic analysis of dreams. I also kind of Google stuff too, like what does the world say this is symbolic, and kind of get a feel for whether this is actually something that is symbolic. It's just research, you know, it's looking through books or thinking about things myself.
What's a good book for people to get started with?
Oh, let me look at my pile of books that are right next to me. Oh, this is like terribly organized, but I like the Element Encyclopedia of Secret Signs and Symbols. It's like a really good survey of stuff, but like it's organized terribly and there's no index. So a lot of the time I'm just like flipping through it and I'm like, what is this? And it's kind of like my own internal Google to be like, what is the right term to like think about this concept? You know, hey, the sun is out and there's darkness, or, you know, like there's a particular thing like a butterfly or a bird, or, you know, this thing is attached to his chest over his heart. Like, what does this mean? And so it's sort of like just asking yourself a lot of questions about the meaning. And truthfully, not everything is symbolic. Sometimes things are just functional. Yeah.
That's so funny. You read that title off and it made me immediately think of Ray Stantz from the Ghostbusters referencing Tobin's Spirit Guide. It's or you know, Giles in the library in an episode of Buffy, you know. It's like let's go to the top pile of books, and they're like, oh, maybe it's in the Encyclopedia of Symbol. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like that type of book. That's funny.
Oh, there's a lot of them. There's symbolic dictionaries or symbolic encyclopedias, and they're just like a really good place to start to like get familiar that these things do mean things and writers do pull on them. So, you know, and you can always just Google too, just X symbolism, and it'll get you down a path. Yeah.
Do you feel like, as somebody who studies this stuff and relates it to media so much, do you think that the majority of symbolism that ends up in the media that we consume is I don't want to say accidental, but almost like it's there because the symbol is the symbol, and not because the author or writer intended for there to be symbolism for you to follow?
Great question. Kind of depends on the writer. Like, I've interviewed a lot of authors who use symbolism quite heavily in their works. And I've thought about this a lot. And some of it is absolutely intentional. Like Ryan Johnson read Young and Bly before writing The Last Jedi. He read A Modern Man in Search of a Soul and Little Book on the Human Shadow, which I recommend everybody read. Bly is like, again, all of these authors, like you have to read them and then be like, okay, I'm going to take these aspects of it for myself. Okay. It actually doesn't matter if it's intentional or not, as long as the person is pulling it from their subconscious, their Ursula K. Le Guin language of the night. If they're pulling it from a place of truth, it actually doesn't matter if they knew that symbol meant something or not. It will surface no matter what. It's like the muses have given them that. It will surface in the work. The problem develops when people are not listening to their own internal language, their whispers in the dark, and then write something and try to make it mean something when the symbolism that they use just accidentally conflicts with the story that they're telling. If the symbolism is from a place of, deep meaning, it comes out naturally.
Yeah.
Right? If they're telling something true. And I can see it happen when somebody is using symbolic language that they do not understand and does not align with the fact that the character is the plot. And if those if those things don't align, then it feels dissonant. It feels like it's broken.
Yeah. Ty and I, we were talking about this in reference to Willow and sort of why Willow has been resonating in a way that some of the Star Wars stuff for the last few years hasn't, right? And the term that I used was there was borrowed symbolism, right? Like Willow is coming from this place of, and I think Andor as well, in the last year and Last Jedi, obviously, they're coming from this place of of intentionality of there's a reason why we're talking about this and these characters in this moment in history, right? Like those stories exist for a reason. They have something to say. And then you flip over to something like The Mandalorian, which can be very emotional. It can have these great moments and these high highs. But then every once in a while it does something and you're like, wait, what? What does that mean?
Or they're trying to write Campbell as a template.
That's one of those things that I was going to say when you're talking about Campbell was there's so many people have turned it into a writing exercise and not a way to analyze the media once it already exists, right?
It's the creator that absorbs Campbell that is going to be the most successful. So has taken him in and has forgotten about him to write. And then it'll come out in the story, right? If you are using Campbell as a template, you will get the symbolism of Campbell, but it won't be the symbolism of you. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's what I mean.
I think it does.
It's interesting. I don't think too much about stories that use borrowed symbolism, to your point, right? And parts of Mandalorian season 2 and parts of Book of Boba Fett, and certainly felt like they understood things. And then it's like suddenly they're off the rails. And I'm not 100% sure why yet. I'm actually really excited to see what happens in Mandalorian season 3 because based on what we saw at Celebration, there's some really interesting symbols that are being pulled out. Right? Going to Mandalore is really, really interesting. Things like that. And I'm excited to think about it. I just also kind of want to, like, if it continues a borrowed symbolism route, like, you can see very dedicated fans being unhappy. Like, it's really interesting to kind of see that as well. And it's not like I want Mandalorian season 3 to not do well. I would actually love it to be amazing because Mandalorian season 1 was speaking from Jon Favreau. There was something, there was a truth in Mandalorian season 1, and I don't know what happened with Mandalorian season 2 and Book of Boba Fett. And if it's back on track, it'll sing, it'll resonate again, right?
I mean, like, just my insight on that is just that season 2 of Mando became, how do we spin off? How do we plant the seeds for all of these shows that we're going to do? Right. And, they came out on Disney Plus Day or whatever the press conference that they did and announced all of the shows. And we're going to have all these shows. They're all going to split off of The Mandalorian, and then they're all going to come back into a big movie at the end, right?
Yeah, like it's like the Mandalorian cinematic universe. Yeah. And maybe that's what happened, and it ended up being sort of corporate saying you must produce more content, and thus you have to make this work. And if that's the case, they might get it back on track, and that's fine, I guess.
It can be course corrected. And so I think what happened is that was a calculated thing. And I think that Dave Filoni probably begrudgingly went, okay, let's set up all of this stuff, put all of these things in. And so all of a sudden season 2 doesn't service the Mandalorian story. It services the beginning of all of these other stories. And then Book of Boba Fett's about to happen, which is the first of these spin-offs, right? And in the midst of that about to happen, everything happens with Gina Carano. She's out. She was going to be the lead of one of these shows.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they had to course correct everything. And those first 3 episodes of Book of Boba Fett are so tight. They're so good. And then
Stephanie
all of a sudden,
Stephanie Green, who's returning for Mandalorian season 3, like, wow, does she have an amazing eye?
Yeah. Like those 3 episodes are one of my favorite Star Wars movies. You can sort of put them together into one story. It's such a great, it made me fall in love with Boba Fett, which is a character that I had written off.
And the Bryce Dallas Howard actual Mandalorian episode within the Book of Boba Fett is also just
a really tight story, really tight episode.
Like, symbolically very significant. Like it's really funny because if you go back to the episodes where Alex and I are like, okay, it feels like there's a bunch of different stuff happening, and we're like very confused about these things, and it's hard.
I think that there was supposed to be more story between Book of Boba Fett originally, and like the roadmap between Book of Boba Fett and Mandalorian season 3. I think that maybe Rangers of the New Republic was supposed to have already come out by now, right? In the schedule. But because that all of a sudden gets taken out, now all of a sudden, now we're going to get back to Mando in season 3. And, we've got a chunk of our story missing. And in that story, we would have figured out when, like, there would have been time for him to go get Grogu. That would have happened. Right. And so it got brought into the middle of the Book of Boba Fett so that season 3 of Mando could happen the way that it was meant to happen, so that they could get it back on track.
Yeah. I definitely see that. Yeah. And you know what? Hey, if Mandalorian season 3 is tight and they know that what they're going to tell, that's great. I'm really excited to talk about the show and talk about the symbolism. Yeah. David W. Collins is going to be the sound designer on the show, so I'm happy to listen to it.
So that might be all just be me trying desperately to have hope that, like, no, guys, everything's going to be fine. It's going to go back to as good as season 1 if they do keep borrowing symbolism and bringing things in J.J. Abrams is even worse, because there's stuff in his 2 movies, as much as I love The Force Awakens, that is just there because it was a cool piece of concept art. And it's like,
but that's still, so George did that, right?
Yeah.
So George had a better sense of the direction that he was trying to go with.
Yeah.
And so when the symbol or the thing that arose from the concept artist's soul came and presented itself to him, he said, yes, that fits the road, the map, the goal, and George was very good at seeing the things and being like, yes, this feels right. Mm-hmm. I don't really want to talk about Tross because like it happened, but I actually think that TFA, there was a lot of hands, and if it had taken the symbolic, laying the breadcrumbs or laying the seeds for growth is always great. And then they had Ryan pick them up and he grew them, and then they just made decisions that ignored the garden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is one of those things where it's like, let's just sidestep the rest of that. Let's just sidestep Tross. Let's jump into another one of these questions. Karen asked, what has been your most memorable interaction with someone you admire? I think this is specifically in relation to the podcast, obviously. So somebody that you've had on the show that you admire, what sticks out? This is almost like a lightning round question. You got to go with the first thing that jumps into your head.
I'm really struggling with this one because David W. Collins is so fresh in my mind. Because as we are recording his episode on Willow, and like his work at Skywalker Sound is just so fresh. But I'm gonna not say David W. Collins, even though that's my instinct, because it's Ken Liu.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, Ken Liu, the author of the Legends of Luke Skywalker. I thought I understood mythology before I spoke with Ken Liu, and I realized I did not. And as much as like I had done research, he set me on this path of like, I had read Legends of Luke Skywalker and I became obsessed. because of how the book was speaking to me in analogy and metaphor. And it is the only book you need to understand Star Wars. I stand by this. It is the most Star Wars of books. A lot of people hate it. It's very childish, right? But that's Star Wars. It's meant for 9 to 12-year-olds.
Yeah.
And when I spoke with him, he opened my eyes to things that I was thinking about or starting to think about, and then said, Marie-Claire, you have so much more to think about. And that encouraged me to ask way more whys and answer way more questions that I had that I didn't even, like, it's one of those experiences where it's like suddenly my brain, galaxy brain exploded. And so then I had to spend many, many months trying to figure out why. And from that gave me more of the energy and the wanting to understand other people's whys. He understood that a dark side character doesn't need to stay in the dark. And I had never heard that from an author or from anyone talk about Star Wars before, even though redemption is so key to the original trilogy. Legends of Luke Skywalker, Ken Liu.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think that's the perfect answer right there. Yeah, I mean, I remember because you came on Faster, More Intense and we talked about Legends of Luke Skywalker, and I've read the manga, but I still haven't dug into the rest of the book, and it's one of those ones that's on my list.
Legends of Luke Skywalker has a bunch of stories in it, and they're quite literally all about the soul of Star Wars. The one that actually blew my mind, and the reason it was so funny because I read it just as I was starting to record with Ty. Like I read it like the same week or something that I started to record. So it's like I read this book and I'd already been thinking about symbolism quite heavily to record with Ty. And the story in Legends of Luke Skywalker, which is a frame story based on a sort of ship that is moving farther from one planet to the Canto Bight, like casino planet for racing. And on the ship are a bunch of kids that are like the deckhands and like take care of the fathers in the ship, who are all like teenagers working on this ship, and they tell each other stories about Luke Skywalker. And the story that blew my mind is called iDroid, and it's quite literally about a droid who it mechanically falls to the dark side and is saved by Luke Skywalker. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph. We droids think in binary, ones and zeros, on and off, yes and no. This gives us clarity, makes us happy. Things are either real or not real, known or not known. A thinking individual is either an organic or a droid. Simple, right? At least most of the time. Okay. We droids think in binary. What does that mean to you?
The binary, like on and off, and it's like light and darkness, right?
Yes,
like
it is. It's the Force.
Yeah,
it's the Force.
By putting it in terms of binary, it doesn't put a connotation on it of good or evil, right? Light or dark. It's on or off. They're just positions, right? And light and dark, they're just positions.
Yes or no?
Yes or no. Yeah, like it's context that makes them good or bad.
And in the story, Zeta is captured and is brought to a mining planet. This was my start of my mining planet obsession, and is made into a bad droid by having a switch flipped in Zeta's brain, and they become an enforcer. An enforcer, a Force user, who is there to keep the other droids in line in this mine. One droid is brought in, and it's R2-D2. And R2-D2 is a rebellious droid that, as much as Zeta wants to rebel against the programming that has been switched in their brain, they can't. They become very good at being an enforcer and forcing the other droids to work in this punishing mine that destroys them. And eventually Luke Skywalker shows up in the guise of a droid. It's wonderful. And he saves them all. Zeta's there and is fighting Luke Skywalker and is about to be destroyed by Luke Skywalker. And Luke decides to save Zeta and flip the switch and say, now you can make choices again. Now you can be in control of your own destiny. And that story showed me Ken Liu understood the fundamentals of the dark side and gave me the phrase, well, we talked about it. I'm like, it's like Zeta and dark side users are stuck in a maze of pain and they can't escape. And that started this whole like understanding of what darkness actually is in Star Wars, and started me down this path to talk with people about the symbolism of darkness more and more, and understand that it is just off, right? And these are all metaphors. Yes, Darth Vader is evil. Yes, Palpatine is evil. But it's also just a metaphor for when you're not kind to yourself. You're not kind to the world. You're more selfish because you're stuck in a maze of pain.
Yeah, that's that one's in the manga as well, and it's my favorite one. It's got the moment at the end where he looks, he's watching Luke walk away with R2, and Luke and R2 are kind of almost like joking with each other of like, oh, that, you know, I it was kind of skin of our teeth for a second there. Like, I didn't know if we were going to make it out. Like these two old friends that have been on all of these adventures, and Zeta is like looking at Luke and recognizes that he has a droid hand, that he has a robotic hand. And that thing from the beginning, from the first paragraph, comes back of like, you're either human or you're a droid, right?
Unless you're both.
Unless you're both. And it takes this symbol that Luke has, which in the movie is this symbol of what he could become in a negative way, of like when he looks at his hand and he looks at the dismembered hand of Vader, and he goes like, how far away am I from becoming this? Right. And that's when he decides to throw down the lightsaber. But then that story turns that symbol on its head, and all of a sudden the fact that Luke has a droid hand means that he also has empathy for droids that other people might not have, because he has this cybernetic component to him. And it was like, I was like, I have never in my entire Star Wars fandom seen Luke from this perspective. What a gift.
But the reason he had empathy for his father was because he had a droid hand, and his father had a droid hand, and he has that darkness within him too. And he recognized that darkness in Return of the Jedi. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. So there it is, like, good Star Wars, the best Star Wars makes other Star Wars better. That is like, to me, that is the truest thing about being a Star Wars fan. And
Ken's book, like, honestly made me like, I felt like I had a fairly robust understanding of Star Wars.
Yeah.
And Ken made me go back and say, do you? Like, I always knew Ben Solo would be redeemed. It was never a question to me. He was Han and Leia's kid. But I didn't understand that all of us need to be redeemed.
Yeah.
And that's why we tell these stories.
Is just that thing of like, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And the teacher comes in all sorts of forms. It might be a frog on the side of the road that you're nice to, and he teaches you how to use magic, or it might just be like an interaction. It might be a piece of media.
I really love that. I really love that, Mike. Yeah, I really love it. I also think that, like, you know, to be Joseph Campbell-y in this moment, I think when you're following your bliss and you're listening to that, the answers appear. Yeah. I know, like, it feels like heebie-jeebie, but the best thing you can do is listen to your own self. Clarissa Piccola Estes, who have talked a lot on Willow and a little bit on Our Power of Myth and Symbolisms to do with feminine, both divine and dark. She would say that all of us have natural intuition in ourselves. And when we listen to it, we will find the right answers. And a lot of the time, we just need to, we ignore it because society says what is drawing us, what is pulling on us is actually not what we should be doing. We should be going to our jobs every day, and we should be, you know, doing our responsibilities and all of those things. And sometimes you have to allow yourself to be the guide, your heart, your bliss, your joy. I'm obsessed with calling bliss joy because of George Lucas, and absolutely leading with your heart is the secret.
When you're open to it, that's when good things happen, right? And which is one of those things, like you said, it sounds kind of heebie-jeebie. It sounds a little airy-fairy, like, oh, you know, The Secret, right? Like, it sounds like that sort of thing. But this is my number one quote from Star Wars, and it's the one that I will always go back to time and time again whenever I'm talking about it. It always comes up. Many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. And it's not that all of a sudden all of those things became true. They were true already. You weren't looking at them that way at that time. You were looking at Star Wars from the perspective that you had, and then Rian Johnson came along and he kicked open this door and went, hey, look at all this stuff. And that put you on a different path, and it changed your perspective. And now all of a sudden you're looking with that lens. And now all of a sudden all this other stuff is going to start showing up as well. Right. And that's that's what happened to me, is that like all of a sudden I started, once I could understand why somebody else might like Reylo, I started to see the value in it. And when I started to see the value in it, it started to have value to me. And once it had value to me, I started looking for it.
Yeah.
And once I started looking for it and couldn't find enough of it, I needed to make some. And I started drawing it. And when I started drawing it, I had to understand it even more. And it was this thing that like, it just fed itself. It was just this monster inside of me that just needed to get everything that it could and get out and be shared with the world. And that's what, like, that to me, like, that's what seeking joy, that's what following your bliss looks like, is, and you know that you're on that path. I know that I'm on that path right now with Willow because it's all I can think about. It's all I can think about. It's all I want to talk about. It's all I want to draw. There's something important there. There's something special, right?
I think that's just how you get as a creator, that like you DM'd me about this. You're like, Marie Claire, a lot of talent is just, practice. And I was like, I hate being reminded of that.
It's time. It's time plus interest, right? Like that's because people will say to me all the time with my drawing, oh, you're so talented. And they say it and it almost feels dismissive. I get upset with it. I could never rubs me the wrong way.
Be like that. And, certainly I had benefits of having, a weird formative education, right? Mm-hmm. But I also spend a lot of time and interest in discovering and figuring this out. And once you start to kind of get into the habit of this, you start to listen to yourself a lot more, and it like bubbles up from deep inside of you because you're paying attention to that subconscious itch, need thing, right? It's in you and you have to get it out. You have to express it. And so when I do my, like, especially Power of Myth and Symbolism episodes, or my Way of the Force, or meta music episodes, especially, or sometimes discussion episodes, sometimes I'm like, I just got to talk about this. It's because something has been like brewing under the surface. My dad used to say, like, sometimes he has this idea and he can feel it, but he doesn't know what it means. And so he would go for a walk, or he would have a bath, and he would almost enter like a liminal space. He would experience liminality and it would rise to the surface. And like, to me, that I have to just be like, I'm going to work on this until it's out of me. I can feel it. It's in me. It has to get out. And it's because I can feel that feeling. And when you have things that resonate with you, ideas, story, something that is speaking to you on a deeply subconscious level, you're going to feel that, and there won't be enough, right? You have to be kind to yourself and rest, but there will never be enough, because that's coming from the energy that you're getting from the subconscious, from the dark side. It's integrating into you, and so you're getting all that energy back.
Yeah, it's so funny. You said like you could go for a walk, find this like liminal space, and it made me think like podcasting is by its nature a liminal space, right? Like you and I are sitting here on a Thursday night, as the minutes get by, it gets later and later and later, but it kind of doesn't matter. It also is very important that we keep track of the time, but the other aspect of it is that like, this is when we're recording, when we're having this conversation, but everybody else is going to hear this later. How much later is actually unknown. It's a complete variable, right? Some people are going to hear this when you post it. Some people are going to hear this 3 years from now. Yeah. And it might be exactly the thing that they needed to hear in that moment. And that's why they downloaded the episode. And you can't know that. So this conversation is unstuck from time. It is in a liminal space, a very literal liminal space.
I've never thought about it like that, but you know, I'll get like an email every couple of months and it's like, thank you for this X podcast, or Marie Claire, you've made a difference in my life. How can you not want to still do this? When like you'll get an email and it's like, Marie Claire, you saved my life. I've had that more than once. Yeah. I don't know what I did because I'm just using my podcast to work through my own stuff. I mean, certainly since 2020, I think for Star Wars fans, there's been a little bit of therapy that needed to happen. And I think that, like all therapy, there are ups and downs in it, and there have been ups and downs over the last 3 years. But working through that as a community, as a fandom, is an important thing. It's funny because like that is why Willow is hitting in the way that it's hitting for so many of us, and it's very clear who it's hitting for in the best, rightest way. Yeah, I hope it hits everybody because everybody needs this story.
Let's read another question. Okay, so this kind of goes off of the last one. Hannah asks, what was your dream podcast interview when you were first starting out, and what is your current dream podcast interview now? So I think there's a little assumption in here that maybe you've interviewed your dream podcast guest at some point over the course of the last little bit. Did you have a dream starting out, and have you interviewed that person, or is that still a dream?
Yeah. So when I started out, I actually had a list of people I wanted to have on the podcast. And it was, I mean, George Lucas is on the list, right?
Yeah.
And I find interviewing to be incredibly hard. I've been told I'm very good at it. And I hope I am, but I find it very hard. It's very taxing from a tactical perspective, like trying to schedule interviews, trying to get the attention of the people to be like, I'm valuable, please come and talk to me. But I have actually crossed off quite a few people that were on that list. Phil Shostak has always been on that list. Jason C. Fry, Leland Shee, Charles Soule, Claudia Gray, and most recently, David W. Collins. And so it's really wonderful just to talk to creators and hear from them. I don't have any actors on my list. And that's because with very rare exception, I don't think that actors have the perspective to talk about the story the way writers, story group, and directors or storytellers like David W. Collins can. And I'm just not interested in personal character perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting thing. I've interviewed mostly voice actors for the Clone Wars stuff. And when I talk to them, it always feels it's usually in a junket situation, but it always feels that way too. Like it's very hard to get outside of that. You'll hear people ask them questions along those lines. Ask Daisy Ridley what she thinks about Rey's story, and her response is, that's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
I just say what they put on the paper, right? Yeah. And it's not her being glib, and it's not her, I don't think that that's her riding a line or trying to be political. I think that's very literal for her of like, listen, the smarter people than me tell me what to do in those situations. I'm an actor. There's a reason there's a director on the set, right?
I think that's very true. And there are some few exceptions. Maybe there's one actor on my list. It's probably Sam Witwer. Yeah, Sam Witwer is on my list just because he has a very specific understanding of the dark side and the Force. Yeah. And my podcast is named What the Force. And I feel like we could go at it and it would be like a really fun conversation.
Can I tell you what my dream scenario would be
sure.
when it comes to actors? I would love to get Sam Witwer and Freddie Prinze Jr. on the same podcast and just but
they talk on podcasts all the time.
Yeah, but I just want to start them up and just get out of the way and just listen to Kanan and Darth Maul argue about the Force.
Say they have to do it all in their voices. Yes, you can talk about anything you want, but you have to be in character.
Yeah, in character the whole time.
Yeah, it's with very few exceptions, that I think actors have a wide enough view to understand like the story from how I like to think about the story. And it's no insult to them. They're good at their craft, but their craft isn't what I'm interested in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's that's that point of view. That's that perspective, right?
Yeah.
Your focus. That's the other Star Wars quote that I love to go back to, is what Qui-Gon says to Anakin: "Your focus determines your reality."
Some people just don't get it, right? Like you can say that, and that maybe that's why What the Force is so good for people, is that
I think so.
I like to think about these things in terms of its relation to myself, the story, all of those things, and to draw parallels, because like giving it context and conceptualizing it from a different angle allows people to absorb it better.
Yeah, cool. I have one more fan question on here that I wanted to get to, that I thought was a really fun one. This one's from Melody. If you could see any story adapted to a musical, which would you choose? There's a lot of great questions in here, and I've tried to pull out some of the ones as anytime there's like listener questions, or try and kind of consolidate a little bit and go like, people are asking a lot of this, who asked it the best? But then every once in a while you get one that just sticks out like a sore thumb. And I was like, I want to get Marie Claire's answer on this one. Any story adapted to a musical, which story would you choose?
Psyche and Cupid. Easy.
Yeah, you were so quick on that. You would have been even faster if I wasn't talking for so long. That's funny.
No, I had to think about it. I really love Psyche and Eros, and yeah, I love that story so much. And there's I Want songs in there, and there's solid conflict, and yeah, it's a heroine's journey, which is always amazing to see as a musical, because fundamentally musicals are femme gaze because of the expression of emotion by the characters out loud, right? They tell you what they feel in song, right?
Yeah.
That would be just amazing. And Psyche and Cupid is the original, one of the original Beauty and the Beasts, and it has all of that in there. All of that. And I've seen Mythic, which is the Hades, it's the Persephone musical where she falls in love with Hades and goes to the underworld and makes choices. And it worked really well as a rock musical. It was really great. So if you ever listen to musical music, listen to Mythic. It's not Hades Town. It is different. It is, in my opinion, so good. So good. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, I think that's all of the questions that I've got. How are you feeling? Do you feel like you've been celebrated? Because I hope that you feel like you've been celebrated on this episode.
I don't know. It's such a weird thing to be like, hey, I have to mark this time. Yeah. I do have some thoughts on 5 years.
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
I've been using this metaphor a lot. So the only reason I feel like I'm as good as I am now and will probably be better in the future is because I keep on doing this. It's the time and interest factor, right? I spend a lot of time working on this, and I have a lot of interest. And the drive to continuously do it is something I'm always amazed at. But it's because I have to ask myself these questions. And when I do, people find interest in it, and that helps give me energy, right? People listening in tell me this meant something to them. This was important to learn about. I learned something, or I understood something about myself by listening to you. That is just absolutely amazing. And I appreciate every single person that has listened to my podcast and tried it out. And honestly, at my lowest points, it's the only reason I continued to podcast, right? Somebody still wanted to listen to what I had to say. What? That's insane. Anybody wants to listen to what I have to say? So I think it's just, I had a lot of thoughts earlier on this evening about esoteric things that I could bring up, but I'm just very thankful that I have had 5 years of this as an opportunity, and that people have been so kind to me along the way.
Speaking as someone who's gotten the great privilege to get to know you over the last year, really went from being online acquaintances and hung out celebration, and we've become friends, and people are kind to you because you are a kind person. Like that's what that comes down to. And it comes across in everything that you do, your interactions online, the way that you approach things on the show. That's, I think, at the end of the day, one of the main things that makes What the Force what it is. The information is great, and everybody eats it up, and that's all well and good. But if it wasn't coming from somebody who was as genuine and wonderful as you, I don't know that it would sink in. I don't know that it would go down as smooth as it does, because it's dense stuff. Like I said before, it's a lot. It can be a lot in an episode, but you come at it from such a genuine, an earnest place. That's the Luke Skywalker quality. Anytime I think about earnestness, I think about what George said about that character and why Mark Hamill was the right guy for the job, is because that's what Luke needed to be above all, was earnest. It's what we want from our hero, right? And so as the hero of this podcast, which you might not see yourself that way, but you are, because you're the central figure. You're the one. Everybody else who comes along to help along the way, we're all there to support you and keep you going on the path. But at the end of the day, you're the one who keeps trudging, who keeps going.
Yeah.
In the good times and the bad times. That's kind of the heroic aspect of continuing to podcast.
This has absolutely been my own journey. Yeah. I never really thought of it good. Like that. Yeah. I don't know why. It's so funny.
So yeah, I mean, I'll say for everybody that listens, it's okay. I was the right person for you to ask to do this, because I started as a listener, and then get to come on and talk to you this way. Thank you so much for everything. I mean, like, speaking personally, I was in a tricky place when I came to your podcast. And I think without this show, I might not have found my way out of that tricky place with as much ease, and it would not have been as good of an experience as it ended up being. And I would have missed out on a whole aspect of Star Wars that wasn't there for me before. I was blind to it. I just wasn't seeing it. And then all of a sudden, this whole new avenue was opened up to me that has allowed me to appreciate it and love it even more. So I know that you've done that for me, which means that I know that you've done that for everybody in the audience at one point or another. So thank you for all of that, for 5 years of that. That's so amazing.
Thank you for telling me. It sounds so stupid. I'm literally like the worst at accepting.
I know you are.
Things.
And that's why I make sure that I say to you as much as possible that you're doing such a good job and you are amazing. And everybody who can hear this right now agrees with me. Like, that's the thing, is I know that everybody, and I'll tell you, because we podcast with a lot of the same people. I've been poaching a lot of your guests for my shows. Because I hear them on your show and I'm like, that person is awesome. I want to talk to them about something too. And when we're off air and we talk about you, it is always, always, always what a great, wonderful person you are, on top of the fact that you are so smart and so knowledgeable and so good at this, but just also that you are just a good person.
I don't see how you can look as closely at the mythology of Star Wars and what it means for how we are all interconnected, and the forces in the rock, the tree, the ship, we're all connected, and not love others with that love, that you are them, they are you. I don't see how you can get that close to the core of Star Wars and not love others. I don't see that. Yeah.
I think George would be really, really happy to hear that sentiment, because I think that that's what he was after, which is why it's the core, right? That's why that is at the center of it, because that's what he was trying teach everybody with these stories. So that's great.
It absolutely was what he was trying to teach everybody. And I'm still a student. I think that's the key is like, and I want to tell people, if you're interested and you're like, I've got this thing that I want to do, I'm saying yes to you. Mm-hmm. I want to create something, do it. That is also part of loving others, because you're putting a piece of yourself out there into the world, and somebody's going to pick it up and say, this, I understand this. And you're connected to that other person. That is the force. Mm-hmm. So what the force? Well, it's that putting yourself out there in the universe for others to see, and they see a little bit of themselves in you.
I honestly can't think of a better way to put the button on this whole conversation and on what is a celebration of 5 years of this podcast than what you just said. So
that's the end.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. We did it. We got there. Again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this with you. It means a lot.
Mike, where can people find you?
Yeah. Oh my goodness, in too many places. You can follow me over on Twitter at Arkwulf, ARKWULF. And you'll get a lot of my random thoughts about all sorts of things, but interspersed with that, you'll get my Willow fan art at the moment, but Star Wars fan art, Marvel stuff, all sorts of things that I'm into, I draw. You can also follow me on Instagram. And if you don't want to hear what I have to say about stuff, you just want to see my drawings, Instagram's a better place. And that's at Arkangelwulf, ARKANGELWULF. That's Arkwulf is the short version of Archangel Wolf. And but if you just want to hear what I have to say, but you don't want to look at my drawings, which I guess that's okay too, you can go listen to one of my podcasts. Force Perspectives is my Star Wars podcast that is just kind of whatever we feel like talking about, but we'll be doing Mando recaps when that comes back. Rebel Cells is the current incarnation of the podcast that I've been doing for almost 15 years. It started as Frontlines, the Clone Wars podcast, and then became the Rebels podcast, and then became Rebel Cells, which is all dedicated to Star Wars animation. So we do reviews and recaps of animated content on that show. And then I have my other podcast, Perfect 10, which is sort of my favorite passion project right now that I wish everybody would go listen to. And in particular, there are 2 episodes that this audience would really, really be interested in. The first is your episode, Marie Claire, where we talked about Lore Olympus. And that's a fantastic episode that I love. And we've only done about 8 episodes so far, but it's still one of my favorites. I think it'll be one of my favorites for a long time. It is second only to Ty's episode about A Knight's Tale, which I think this audience would really, really dig. So go listen to that. Go listen to that for sure.
They're both so good. Yeah, they're really, really good. Yeah.
But yeah, that's my passion project right now. So everybody go check that one out. I'm not hard to find. Turn over a rock in the internet and you'll find something I've done.
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining me, interviewing me, and just discussing podcasting for long lengths of time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Right. Cheers. Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie Claire Gould, your host. Our music is provided by Christy Carew for What the Force. We have a Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We would like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love and are obsessed with What the Force: Melody, Night Huntress, In Wild Space, How Rude, Anna Perez, Neil, Christian Luca, Josh Johnson, Scott C., and Susan. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or other pod apps. It helps people find the show. Check out our other channel on YouTube, What the Fiction. You can connect with us on Twitter at WT Force Show, What the Force Podcast on Facebook, and our website, whattheforce.ca. We also have a Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.